I moved to the greater Nashville area in 2011, and since then I consider myself very fortunate to have seen some really great concerts, and quite a few of those have happened at the Ryman Auditorium. I will say the Ryman isn't my first choice of venues to see my favorite bands play. I mean, the building itself is incredible, the sound quality is top notch, the staff is always wonderful, but just the kind of bands I like to see, the Ryman isn't the best place for them. The pews are kind of cramped. You can't really get up or move around all that much. Most of the first floor, the view is at least partially blocked by the balcony, and it's in like the heart of downtown, which for people who don't enjoy going to Lower Broadway, which is most of the Nashville local residents, it's not the easiest place to get to. But every time I see a show there, especially from artists that I love and respect, one of the things that they always repeat is how the Ryman is a bucket list venue for them, how they've always dreamed of playing there. And I guess I've never really understood that. I mean, I get it for like up and coming country artists, but for the more rock oriented bands that I enjoy seeing, I just didn't really understand that. But then I got thinking that I don't really know a lot about the detailed history of the Ryman. So I thought it'd be fun to just kind of like dig into it and see what I can learn about this venue that is so awe-inspiring for so many artists that I really. The story of the Ryman goes back to 1892 when it was opened as the Union Gospel Tabernacle by Thomas G. Ryman. In the late 1800s, Tom was one of the most successful riverboat operators in Nashville, and so if you know anything about Nashville, you know that there's a river that runs right through downtown. So at that time, riverboat transportation was super important, especially considering Nashville's central location in the south is just so convenient to pass through it. So if you owned a lot of riverboats and you were successful at that, you made a ton of money. And Tom also owned quite a bit of saloons down near the river in the downtown area. So in 1885, this super popular evangelist named Samuel Porter Jones came to town. He was kind of known as like the Billy Graham of his day. He regularly drew crowds of thousands. He had standing room only in a lot of his meetings that were often held in a tent because there just weren't chapels big enough for him at the time. And he kind of preached directly to men. He had that bravado to him that really impressed men, and that was kind of seen as the hardest demographic to reach. So he had a lot of support from his church organization, and just he was super popular evangelist. So Tom decides that he's going to go to this revival meeting and he's going to see what Sam Jones has to say. At first, Tom was not a fan. He went with the intention of heckling Sam, actually. I mean, Tom owned a whole bunch of saloons. He doesn't really want someone in town telling people that drinking and dancing is something that maybe they should cut back on a little bit. I mean, he's got 7 children to feed. He needs these saloon businesses to run well. So he goes with the intention of heckling Sam. But at that meeting, which happened in a tent, nothing short of the miracle happened. He was converted to Christianity, and after that meeting, he went up to Sam and he vowed to build a chapel in downtown Nashville so that Sam never had to preach in a tent in the city again. There would be a place for people to go hear Sam preach and learn more about Jesus and Christianity. Originally, they wanted to name the building after Tom, but he adamantly refused, so it was called the Union Gospel Tabernacle. I think there was actually a concert that happened before the first preaching that happened there, but I just saw that kind of like in passing, so I can't really verify that. But I mean, someone out there knows, let me know what the first concert at the Ryman was. But it officially opened in 1892 when Samuel Porter Jones was the first person to preach at the Ryman. Sam in that first meeting actually said, "I believe for every dollar spent in this tabernacle, there'll be $10 less spent in the future on court trials. This tabernacle is the best investment the city of Nashville ever made." End quote. When Tom Ryman died in 1904, he was really well loved in the community. He was a very generous man. He helped out the community a lot, and he honestly, just the business he brought to the community was super helpful in establishing Nashville as kind of like that center of Tennessee in the South. So they held his funeral at the Union Gospel Tabernacle, and Samuel Porter Jones preached at his funeral. It was held on Christmas Day, and thousands of people attended it. And at that funeral, Samuel stood up in front of the congregation and he proposed for the last time that they change the name to the Ryman Auditorium in honor of Tom. And then he asked everyone in agreement to stand, and every single person in the building stood. And so the name officially became the Ryman Auditorium. But when the building was constructed, it actually went over budget, meaning that the building was in debt from the day it opened, and they were fighting against that debt and didn't really know what to do about that. I mean, these like revivals weren't bringing in a ton of money for the venues they were held in. So enter Miss Lula C. Naff, who actually went by LC to trick the people who thought that women couldn't possibly do things. She got her start working for the company that kind of handled the bookings. They were like a theater circuit, but they weren't doing all that well, and they actually closed in 1914. When that company closed, she convinced the Ryman Board of Directors to let her take over, essentially booking all events at the Ryman. In those early days, Lula sacrificed quite a lot to bring some high-quality talent into the Ryman. It's rumored, and Lula was very quick to carry on with that rumor, that she took a second mortgage out on her house to bring in the very popular Irish singer John McCormick, who requested like $3,000 up front in order to perform anywhere, which is a large sum of money back then, especially for a struggling theater. So she was able to somehow raise that money and bring him in, and that was just like a massive boost for the appeal of the Ryman. In 1902, she booked Booker T. Washington for a speech to the General Conference of the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, and in 1913, Helen Keller gave a speech in a little Q&A session there. So Lula was just kind of like out here getting stuff done. She was booking in high prominent people, but not just entertainers, not just musicians. She was scheduling boxing events. She was scheduling cattle sales, basically anything she could to try and scrape a little bit off of that debt and make the Ryman profitable and sustainable. So the Ryman board recognized all of the work she had done and all the sacrifice and effort she put into just building up the Ryman, so they offered her the role of general manager in 1920. I mean, she was basically running the Ryman for 7 years before that, so, might as well, right? When she officially became the GM, she carried on right where she left off, and she ended up booking Harry Houdini in to perform at the Ryman. Lula was a trailblazer, and not just for women, but for the industry in general. She repeatedly fought back against censorship and even went to court a couple times to kind of push back against that. She fought hard for the Ryman and to make it profitable and to make it something that was good for the community. Aside from just saving the Ryman from debt, which she was able to do, she was able to get them out of debt and get them profitable. She also saved the Ryman from a fire once. And then she assembled a cleanup crew to quickly make sure the auditorium was ready for the show that still happened that night after a fire in the theater. Also, just to kind of like touch on a little bit of the changes that were happening to the Ryman. When it was started, it was kind of like an in the round thing. The preacher would stand in the middle and there would be benches all around him. And there was no balcony when it first started, but I think the balcony was added later on in like 1897, I want to say. And eventually a stage was put in, so it kind of cut off that in the round so that more performances could happen there. It's also important to note that Lula could rub people the wrong way. She was super opinionated. She was a adamant Methodist and very quick to tell you if you were getting Methodism wrong, at least according to her. She was also, in her own words, an unreconstructed rebel, and she would forbid anyone from talking about Abraham Lincoln in her presence. She was a larger-than-life personality, and she helped establish the Ryman as a profitable theater and as kind of like the bedrock of the Nashville performing arts scene. In 1943, Lula brought in a show that would change the course of the Ryman forever. She allowed the Grand Ole Opry to make the Ryman its official new home. The Grand Ole Opry was started in 1925 when the National Life and Accident Insurance Company launched the WSM, which stands for We Save Millions, barn dance out of their studio in downtown Nashville. It was kind of like a radio station show that was happening. And this was pretty quickly after the development of radio in general. In 1927, George Hay, who was like the announcer of the barn dance, called it the Grand Ole Opry for the first time, and it was actually kind of like a joke. The barn dance followed an hour of classical music, so he said one night, "For the past hour, we have been listening to music largely from grand opera, but from now on, we will present the Grand Ole Opry." And the name stuck, and it became the Grand Ole Opry. Crowds started to clog the hallways of the radio station because they wanted to watch the barn dance happen live. So the radio station realized that they needed a little bit of a bigger venue for that. So eventually they went across town to the Belcourt Theater, and then quickly outgrew that as well. So they switched to a place in East Nashville that I think was like more of a revivalist meeting place. That didn't really work out, so they went to the War Memorial Auditorium in downtown. And that stuck for a little bit, but I think they got a little bit too rowdy for the War Memorial, so then they went to the Ryman. It was actually at the War Memorial that they started charging people 25 cents to get in and see the show because more people wanted to go than they had seats available, so they had to charge people for their seat. In June of 1943, the Grand Ole Opry officially moved into the Ryman, which is now its most famous former home, and for 31 years, every Saturday night, the Grand Ole Opry was broadcasted from the Ryman. Every Opry show at the Ryman sold out for 31 years. Because the Opry was nationally broadcast and one of the most popular shows, at least through the South, it really established the Ryman as kind of like this mecca of country music and music in general. And it's because of this association with the Grand Ole Opry that the Ryman is now known as the mother church of country music. But the Ryman was never really supposed to be this massive performance venue. I mean, the backstage area, which, remember, it was started as an in-the-round theater, didn't really exist. There was like one changing room, and they weren't great. It was already showing its age a little bit. So a lot of the performers, these superstars of country music, Hank Williams, Loretta Lynn, like all of these performers wouldn't really want to hang around backstage, so they would kind of go into the alley behind the theater, which Tootsie's Orchid Lounge was also attached to that alley. So a lot of times they would just walk over and have a beer at Tootsie's, so you could kind of like see some of the biggest stars of country music just hanging out in a bar in Lower Broadway, and that really helped bring new life to Lower Broadway and kind of establish that bar saloon scene down there that still very much exists today. Lula retired in 1955 and was succeeded by Harry Draper, who was her longtime assistant. He was a classically trained violinist and was a staff violinist for WSM, the radio station that brought the Opry, and also for the Nashville Symphony. He was instrumental in bringing Liberace to the Ryman. In the 70s, the Ryman was starting to show its age even more than it had before, and it was already not the most state-of-the-art venue, and now we're getting on almost 100 years of its existence, so it's starting to be a little bit beaten. So the Grand Ole Opry, because of that, and also because they just kind of realized they had outgrown it a little bit, decided to make their own home, to make their own theater, so that they wouldn't be the Grand Ole Opry presented from the Ryman. It would be just the Grand Ole Opry in their own place. Another reason for that decision was that the Grand Ole Opry was heavily rebelling against that kind of like 60s and 70s hippie movement that was happening at the time. They kind of cemented themselves as a clean-cut, non-controversial thing, so they kind of wanted to move their performers a little bit away from Tootsie's and the Lower Broadway bar scene before they started to get a reputation of alcoholics. On Friday, March 15th, 1974, the Grand Ole Opry broadcasted from the Ryman for the last time. During that show, Minnie Pearl broke down in tears. June Carter Cash closed the show by singing "Will the Circle Be Unbroken?" And to make sure that circle wasn't broken, a large hole was cut in the Ryman stage and inlaid into the center of the stage at the new Opry House, which was like across the river. During its partnership with the Opry, the Ryman hosted many of the greatest performers of all time. Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis, Johnny Cash, the Byrds, Dolly Parton, Loretta Lynn, Louis Armstrong, the Carter Family, Patsy Cline. I mean, you name it, they probably played at the Ryman. But after they moved out, the Ryman kind of entered a dark period. I mean, the Grand Ole Opry wanted to demolish it. They wanted to tear the building down and take the bricks from it and build a chapel next to their new home, which was also an amusement park. They built an amusement park at the same time called Opryland. It's now a mall. The public and a lot of the musicians loudly and vehemently rejected that idea, except for Roy Acuff, who was super on board with tearing it down. He reportedly said that he never wanted another note of music played in that building. He kind of like hated playing there. He thought it was run down, and he wanted just kind of like a more state-of-the-art place to perform in. So after getting like senators and government agencies involved, the Ryman was actually saved. It was named a National Historic Landmark, but still the Opry, who officially owned the building, didn't really do anything with it. I think a large reason for that was they were afraid of its status. They wanted people to go to the new theater. They didn't want the Ryman to be a thing anymore. They wanted to kind of like distance themselves from it. So it just kind of fell into almost 20 years of abandonment. It never closed its doors. It still offered tours throughout that time, but no one performed there. The stage went dark. The windows started breaking. Rats started getting into the building. It was not good for 20 years. In 1983, WSM's parent company was acquired, not very amicably, by American General Insurance. And then American General Insurance sold WSM and all of its properties, which included the Ryman, to Gaylord Entertainment Group. Through his ownership of the Hee Haw television show, Ed Gaylord was well acquainted with most of the Opry stars, so he had like a vested interest in the Opry and the Ryman. Gaylord Entertainment Group started renovations on the Opry in 1993. They had the goal of it once again hosting performances by night and still doing tours during the day. They repaired the windows. They put a new roof on. They stripped away pounds and pounds of gum from the pews and even took out the pews and restored them. And they added more modern things like air conditioning and places for concession and a new lobby that looks great. The Ryman officially reopened as a performance hall in 1994, and the first performance back was a broadcast of A Prairie Home Companion, a weekly radio variety show, which was fitting considering the Ryman's history with the Opry. The Opry did return to the Ryman in 1998 for kind of like a one-off benefit show, but then that was so successful that they decided to do it a couple more times as part of like a celebration of 25 years at their new home. And that's basically the story of the Ryman. I mean, it's still playing shows. I was there 2 nights ago. If you're ever in Nashville, make sure you come down and do a tour of it or catch a show and sit in one of the original pews from 1892 that are still there.